this is institutional aggression, and this is looking now at situational explanations. If you remember in the last video, we looked at situational versus dispositional explanations. Dispositional being the characteristics of the prisoners, the personality. Situational explanations looks at the situation of the prison. Is it that's causing the aggression within the prison? The deprivation model talks about various factors within a prison that cause deprivation. So you're depriving prisoners of certain things, and this causes a kind of stressful circumstance that makes them feel frustrated, and all of that can build to aggression. So let's look at research. Sykes picked out 5 different factors here. First of all, liberty. These are all things that lead to aggression when these things are deprived. Liberty, loss of freedom. The prisoners lose autonomy, so they don't have the power that they used to have, and they're not able to make their own choices for themselves about what they're doing. Goods and services, so they have their access reduced to things like TV, or they can't go to the shops and buy nice things, or choose their own food and that sort of thing. Heterosexual relationships, they're in single sex wards, so they don't have access to heterosexual relationships. Security, they may be afraid for their own safety. So those are 5 really key things that are deprived from prisoners that Sykes picked out. And the link is that having all of these things taken away makes prisoners stressed, frustrated and frightened. And then there's if you're aggressive, it kind of reduces, if you think back to your frustration aggression hypothesis, frustration builds until you're aggressive, and that has a cathartic effect. So if your prisoners are stressed and frustrated, they're more likely to be aggressive, to reduce those negative feelings, and to kind of get a sense of control back. More research then. Cook actually looked at 3 other factors. Overcrowding, so a lot of prisons are overcrowded. There's various research being done that shows the more overcrowded the prisons are, the higher the rate of violence. Heat and noise, when it's warmer and more noisy, negative emotions are higher, and that's again from research. Job burnout from prison staff. When prison staff become really burnt out, they don't engage with the prisoners in the same way, build positive relationships, they're exhausted, and then that kind of rapport between the staff and prisoners isn't there that could have perhaps helped to mitigate or reduce some of the incidents that might have happened. So those were the 3 things that Cook highlighted being issues to do with prisons, situational factors that might affect aggression. Now, thinking of evaluation, we've got various different points here that we can make. Mega G found that aggressive incidents in prisons negatively correlated to the amount of living space for each prisoner. So if you think back to these things that Cook found, that directly supports this first point here, overcrowding. So this study by Mega G supports the idea of a deprivation model, because it's saying that your aggression is directly linked to how overcrowded your prison is. Then this next point is a really interesting one, a really interesting practical application that was taken away. So if these things are causing aggression in prisons, can we go away and set up prisons that have more space, they're less overcrowded, they have outside views, they have less noise, they have lower temperatures? What happens then? Well, actually there were almost no assaults on staff and almost no violence between the inmates. So that is, well, first of all, it supports this theory, but second of all, it's a really useful practical application from the theory to know that this is how we can reduce violence within prisons. However, it was really politically unpopular because actually people feel that prisons should be a deterrent from crime and that it should be a punishment. And so actually making prisons nice and spacious and comfortable and all this was not politically popular, which actually means that it's not a really useful explanation. Although it has a potential explanation, if you can't ever put it actually into practice, that's not very helpful. The economic implications, again, psychology and the economy, you have to be aware of it, is obviously more costly to build better units, but if you can reduce assaults on prison staff, then you're more likely to be able to have a higher staff retention rate, you'll have better staff, and that reduces your costs if you can keep the same staff each time. The model doesn't explain a sudden eruption of violence within prisons, which happens even when the environment hasn't been changed. Levels of violence go up and down. There's obviously some kind of social factors involved, not simply to do with the situation. If the situation is staying constant but the levels of violence fluctuate, this model does not explain that. And then the last point to say is that it doesn't consider the individual characteristics of inmates. We've already looked at the dispositional explanation, the importation model. Actually, there's a lot of evidence for that, some of which you could refer to here if you wanted to. The study with the comparison of the two groups of prisoners in a high and low security unit, actually changing the situation for those prisoners didn't make any difference. It was actually the disposition that predicted the violence. So you can talk about some of that, some of those different studies here, because actually the fact that you've got inmates coming in that are violent is quite a compelling explanation. So it doesn't make sense to completely ignore it, which this explanation does. So that was the deprivation model.